In the quiet town of Oakridge, where everyone seemed to know each other, Officer Miller was a familiar name, but not for the right reasons. She was strict, authoritative, and carried a reputation for being quick to judge, especially when it came to people who didn't fit the mold. For years, Miller had operated on the assumption that her badge gave her the right to police not just laws, but appearances. That morning, Officer Miller was patrolling the town square, her sharp eyes scanning for anything that felt out of place. As she parked near the local grocery store, her gaze landed on Ms. Taylor, a poised black woman in her early 40s, gracefully walking back to her car with a bag of groceries in hand. The sleek luxury car parked in the lot instantly caught Miller's attention. It wasn't a vehicle she expected someone like Ms. Taylor to be driving, at least not in her biased opinion. Her suspicion ignited, Miller narrowed her eyes, watching Ms. Taylor as she unlocked the car and loaded her groceries. "What's she doing in a car like that?" Miller muttered under her breath. Without a second thought, she decided to follow Ms. Taylor, convinced she'd stumbled upon something suspicious. Little did she know, her assumptions were about to lead her into a situation she'd never forget. Officer Miller tailed Ms. Taylor as she drove through the quiet streets of Oakridge. The pristine black luxury car gleamed in the sunlight, a sharp contrast to the modest vehicles usually seen in the neighborhood. Miller's suspicion grew with every turn Ms. Taylor took, her mind racing with baseless assumptions. When Ms. Taylor pulled into a side street and parked momentarily to adjust something in her car, Miller saw her chance. Flipping on her lights, Miller pulled up behind the car and stepped out, her posture rigid with authority. Ms. Taylor rolled down her window, her expression calm and composed. "Good morning, officer." Ms. Taylor greeted politely. Miller didn't return the pleasantries. "License and registration," she barked. "What are you doing driving a car like this in this neighborhood?" Ms. Taylor's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I live nearby. Is there a problem, officer?" "Nearby?" Miller repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "This car doesn't look like it belongs to someone around here. Is it stolen? Or maybe you're borrowing it without permission?" Ms. Taylor blinked, taken aback by the absurdity of the accusation. "This is my car," she replied evenly. "I can provide proof if you'd like." "Sure," Miller snapped, crossing her arms. "Show me." Ms. Taylor reached for her glove compartment, moving deliberately to avoid escalating the situation. She handed over her documents, which clearly showed her ownership of the car. Miller glanced at them, but didn't seem satisfied. "These could be fake," she muttered. "Do you have any idea how many people use forged documents to pull stunts like this?" Ms. Taylor exhaled slowly, keeping her frustration in check. "Officer, I assure you everything is legitimate. If you need further verification, feel free to run the plates." But Miller wasn't interested in verification. Her mind was already made up. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered. "Why?" Ms. Taylor asked, her voice firm now. "I've done nothing wrong." "Step out," Miller repeated, her tone sharper. "You're resisting a lawful order." By this time, a few pedestrians had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Ms. Taylor noticed the curious and concerned looks, but maintained her composure. She stepped out of the car as instructed, holding her hands slightly up in a gesture of compliance. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," Miller announced loudly, grabbing Ms. Taylor's arm and snapping on the handcuffs. The small crowd murmured in disbelief. "What's she even being arrested for?" one man whispered to another. Ms. Taylor met Miller's eyes calmly, her voice unwavering as she said, "I'll see you in court, officer." Miller smirked, leading Ms. Taylor to her cruiser. To her, this was just another job done. But for Ms. Taylor, it was the beginning of a fight to expose the injustice she had just endured. Little did Miller know, the courtroom would soon reveal the truth and turn her smug confidence into stunned regret. The ride to the Oakridge police station was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Ms. Taylor sat in the back of Officer Miller's cruiser, her hands cuffed, her face calm yet resolute. Miller glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her smug expression betraying her misplaced confidence. "This could have gone much easier," Miller said, breaking the silence. "You people always think you're above the rules." Ms. Taylor didn't respond, refusing to engage with the blatant provocation. Instead, she stared out the window, mentally preparing herself for what lay ahead. At the station, the atmosphere was no better. Miller marched Ms. Taylor inside, her voice loud and commanding, as she informed the officers on duty, "Got a suspect here for resisting arrest, might be tied to stolen property too." A few officers exchanged glances but said nothing, their unease evident. Ms. Taylor was processed quickly, but not without unnecessary humiliation. Miller smirked as Ms. Taylor's belongings were taken, and she was placed in a holding cell, her composure intact, despite the degrading situation. "You might want to start thinking about a plea deal," Miller taunted from outside the cell, "because when we're done, you'll wish you'd cooperated." Ms. Taylor looked at her, unshaken. "Officer, you've made a grave mistake. I'll see you in court." Days passed, and the incident began to ripple through Oakridge. The small-town community, where news traveled faster than the morning paper, buzzed with whispers about the arrest. Many residents, including those who witnessed the event, started questioning Officer Miller's actions. "Why would she arrest Ms. Taylor?" a local shopkeeper asked his customer. "She's always been polite and professional. I've seen her driving that car for years." "She didn't resist," said another witness, recounting the scene to a neighbor. "That cop just kept pushing her." The murmurs of doubt soon reached the local media. A small article appeared in the Oakridge Gazette titled, "Arrest Sparks Questions About Police Conduct." It detailed Ms. Taylor's background as a respected community member and subtly questioned Miller's motivations. The article gained traction, with residents sharing it widely on social media. Miller, however, was oblivious to the growing criticism. She carried herself with the same overconfidence, brushing off any concerns raised by her colleagues. To her, this was just another routine case, and she was convinced the courtroom would vindicate her actions. Meanwhile, Ms. Taylor quietly prepared her defense. She was no stranger to the law. Her education and career had provided her with the tools to navigate the justice system. However, she chose not to hire an attorney, opting instead to represent herself. For Ms. Taylor, this wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about standing up against prejudice and holding Officer Miller accountable. When the court date was announced, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, curious locals, and even a few off-duty officers filled the benches, eager to witness what had become the talk of the town. Officer Miller arrived with her usual confidence, dressed sharply in her uniform, ready to deliver her testimony. As the session began, Ms. Taylor stood at the defendant's table, calm and poised. The judge, a seasoned and fair-minded individual, called for opening statements. Miller's attorney painted a picture of Ms. Taylor as uncooperative and suspicious, framing the arrest as necessary and justified. Ms. Taylor, however, wasted no time dismantling the narrative. With precision and eloquence, she presented evidence proving her ownership of the car, including registration documents and proof of purchase. She called on witnesses from the scene who testified that she had complied with every instruction. By the second day of the trial, it was clear the tide was turning. The testimony of the witnesses and Ms. Taylor's impeccable defense left little room for doubt. The jury, visibly uncomfortable with the evidence against Officer Miller, began to shift in their perception. What truly captured the courtroom's attention, however, was Ms. Taylor's calm and eloquent closing argument. She didn't just focus on the incident, but addressed the broader issue of prejudice in law enforcement. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a system that judges people based on how they look rather than who they are. It's about holding those in power accountable for their actions." The courtroom fell silent. the weight of her words resonating with everyone present. Even Officer Miller, who had avoided eye contact throughout the trial, began to look uncomfortable, her confidence faltering. As the trial neared its conclusion, it was clear that Ms. Taylor had not only defended herself, but also brought a much-needed spotlight to an issue many in Oakridge had ignored for too long. The stage was set for the verdict, and everyone in the room knew that whatever the outcome, the town would never view Officer Miller or its justice system the same way again. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the trial began. The case of Ms. Taylor versus Officer Miller had garnered widespread attention in the town of Oakridge, drawing reporters, community members, and even some legal professionals curious to witness what had become a defining moment for the community. Ms. Taylor sat calmly at the defendant's table, her posture poised and confident, while Officer Miller sat across the room, her earlier bravado replaced by a flicker of unease. The judge, an experienced and stern figure, called the room to order. "This court is now in session," he declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "We will hear the case of Officer Susan Miller versus Ms. Clara Taylor." Miller's attorney was the first to speak. He presented his client's version of events, painting Ms. Taylor as uncooperative and suspicious. "Officer Miller was acting in the interest of public safety," he stated. "Ms. Taylor's actions, combined with the circumstances, gave reasonable cause for suspicion." The judge nodded and turned to Ms. Taylor. "Ms. Taylor, would you like to present your defense?" To everyone's surprise, Ms. Taylor stood without legal representation. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and deliberate, "I have chosen to represent myself." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, but Ms. Taylor remained unfazed. She walked confidently to the center of the room, addressing the jury directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ms. Taylor began, her voice steady and firm, "this case isn't about a stolen car. It's about assumptions, prejudice, and the abuse of power." She held up her car registration and proof of purchase, which were promptly entered into evidence. "This vehicle," she said, holding the documents aloft, "has been registered in my name for the past 3 years. There is nothing fake about these documents, despite Officer Miller's claims." She then presented surveillance footage from the grocery store parking lot, which showed her walking calmly to her car and loading her groceries without any sign of suspicious behavior. Witnesses from the scene were called to testify, all recounting that Ms. Taylor had complied with Miller's every instruction, contrary to the officer's claims of resistance. By the time Ms. Taylor finished presenting her evidence, it was clear she had dismantled the prosecution's narrative piece by piece. The jury watched her with rapt attention, their initial skepticism replaced with respect. But Ms. Taylor wasn't done. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she prepared to reveal the final piece of her defense. "Your Honor," she said, turning to the judge, "before I conclude, there's one more piece of information I'd like to share with the court." She reached into her briefcase and produced a framed certificate. "This," she said, holding it up, "is my certification as a licensed judge in the state of New York." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Ms. Taylor continued, her tone unwavering. "I have served as a judge for over a decade, presiding over cases involving some of the very issues we're discussing today: prejudice, abuse of power, and the need for accountability in law enforcement." Officer Miller's face went pale, her confidence crumbling as she realized the gravity of her actions. The very woman she had treated with disdain and disrespect was not just innocent, but a highly respected member of the legal system, someone far more knowledgeable and influential than Miller had assumed. The jury, visibly taken aback, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the judge looked momentarily startled before regaining his composure. "I see," he said, his tone now carrying a hint of newfound respect. "Please, continue." Ms. Taylor took a step closer to the jury, her voice filled with emotion. "When Officer Miller stopped me, she didn't see a law-abiding citizen. She saw someone who didn't fit her narrow view of who should be driving a car like mine. She made a decision based not on facts, but on prejudice, and that decision led to my unlawful arrest. She turned to face Miller directly. Officer Miller, your duty is to protect and serve, not to judge based on assumptions or stereotypes. I wonder, if I were a different race or gender, would you have treated me the same way? Miller looked down, unable to meet Ms. Taylor's gaze. The weight of her actions was finally sinking in. Ms. Taylor then addressed the court as a whole. I don't stand here today seeking revenge or even an apology. I stand here to highlight a problem that goes beyond this case. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in law enforcement or the justice system. It undermines the trust and safety of the very people these institutions are meant to protect. The judge leaned forward, his expression serious. Ms. Taylor, your testimony and evidence have been clear and compelling. This court recognizes your innocence and commends your composure in the face of such injustice. He turned to the jury. You have heard the facts. I trust you will deliver a fair verdict. After a brief deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. We find Ms. Taylor not guilty of all charges, the foreperson announced. The courtroom erupted into applause, the community members present visibly moved by the outcome. As Ms. Taylor gathered her belongings, many approached her to express their admiration. Reporters clamored for interviews, and even the judge took a moment to shake her hand. Officer Miller remained seated, her confidence now replaced with regret. As the courtroom emptied, she approached Ms. Taylor hesitantly. Ms. Taylor, she began, her voice unsteady. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. Ms. Taylor looked at her, her expression calm but firm. That's the problem, Officer Miller, she said. You didn't take the time to see who I was. Don't let this happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone. Miller nodded, her face flushed with shame. I won't, she whispered. The case became a turning point for Oakridge, sparking conversations about prejudice and the need for reform in the police department. Miller was suspended and ordered to undergo bias training, while Ms. Taylor returned to her work, using her platform to advocate for justice and equality. In the end, the trial was not just a victory for Ms. Taylor, but a wake-up call for an entire community. And for Officer Miller, it marked the beginning of a journey toward accountability and, hopefully, change. The courtroom trial had ended, but the ripples of the case were far from over. Ms. Taylor's exoneration and the shocking revelation of her status as a respected judge had sparked conversations throughout Oakridge. The trial had not only cleared her name, but had also shed light on the pervasive issue of bias in law enforcement. Officer Miller stood outside the courtroom, her face pale and her usual confidence nowhere to be seen. She had avoided the reporters and cameras waiting outside, choosing instead to linger in the hallway, grappling with the reality of what had just unfolded. The next day, Miller was called into Chief Reynolds's office. The chief, a seasoned officer who had served the department for decades, was visibly disappointed. Officer Miller, he began, his tone heavy, the department prides itself on serving the community with integrity and fairness. Your actions have not only failed to meet those standards, but have also damaged the trust we work so hard to build. Miller sat in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Effective immediately, the chief continued, you are suspended without pay pending further investigation. Additionally, you will be required to attend mandatory bias training and community outreach programs if you wish to retain your position in this department. Miller nodded stiffly, unable to argue. She knew she deserved the consequences, but the weight of her actions felt heavier than any reprimand. Meanwhile, Ms. Taylor had become a symbol of resilience and justice in Oakridge. Days after the trial, she was invited to speak at a community event organized by local leaders to address the broader issues highlighted by her case. The event, held at the town hall, was packed with residents, reporters, and even off-duty officers eager to hear what she had to say. Taking the stage, Ms. Taylor stood tall and confident, her presence commanding yet approachable. She began her speech with a calm but firm tone. "Good evening, everyone," she said. "First, I want to express my gratitude to this community for standing by me and seeking the truth. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It is part of a larger problem, a problem that exists not just in Oakridge but across the country." The audience listened intently as she continued. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, erodes trust. It diminishes the humanity of those it targets and undermines the integrity of those who act on it. We cannot allow it to persist in our homes, our workplaces, or our institutions. Ms. Taylor paused, letting her words sink in. Accountability is not about blame. It's about growth. It's about looking at our actions, recognizing where we went wrong, and making the effort to do better. That's what I hope this case will inspire, not just punishment for those who act unjustly, but meaningful change that ensures this doesn't happen again. She ended her speech with a powerful call to action. Let us commit to seeing each other as individuals, not stereotypes. Let us build a community where respect, empathy, and understanding are at the forefront. Change starts with us. The room erupted into applause, her words resonating deeply with everyone present. Across town, Miller sat in her small apartment, watching a recording of Ms. Taylor's speech on the evening news. The eloquence and strength in Taylor's voice struck a chord Miller hadn't expected. Each word seemed to cut through her defenses, forcing her to confront the ugliness of her own actions. Miller replayed the events in her mind, the assumptions she had made, the humiliation she had caused, and the arrogance that had blinded her to Taylor's dignity. For the first time in her career, she felt the full weight of what it meant to misuse her badge. She turned off the TV and sat in silence, staring at her uniform hanging on the back of a chair. It no longer felt like a symbol of pride, but a reminder of the responsibility she had failed to uphold. Miller's thoughts shifted to the community outreach programs she would soon be required to attend. She didn't want to go, not out of resistance, but out of shame. Facing the very people she had wronged felt daunting, but deep down, she knew it was necessary. "I have to do better," she whispered to herself. It wasn't a declaration of redemption, but it was a start, a flicker of determination to learn, grow, and prove that she could change. In the weeks that followed, Officer Miller attended her first bias training session. She listened quietly as community members shared their experiences with prejudice and discrimination, their stories raw and unfiltered. For the first time, Miller didn't feel defensive. She felt humbled. Meanwhile, Ms. Taylor continued her work as a judge and an advocate, using her platform to push for systemic change in Oakridge and beyond. She worked closely with local leaders to implement programs aimed at fostering understanding between law enforcement and the community. The story ends with a powerful image. Ms. Taylor standing outside the courthouse, speaking with a group of young students about the importance of standing up for what's right. In the distance, Officer Miller is seen working alongside community members in an outreach program, her demeanor softer, her actions more thoughtful. Though their paths are different, both women are working toward a common goal, a community built on respect, empathy, and accountability. It's a reminder that change, though difficult, is always possible when we choose to see the humanity in each other. As the story fades to black, a calm, reflective voice begins, guiding the audience through the key lessons of what they've just witnessed. Every day, we make choices. Choices about how we see others, how we treat them, and how we use the power and influence we hold. No matter how big or small, this story isn't just about an arrest or a trial. It's about the profound impact of those choices and the ripple effects they can create. The screen shows a montage. Officer Miller's initial confrontation, Ms. Taylor calmly defending herself in court, and the community standing together at the town hall. At its core, this story highlights the dangers of bias. When we judge people by their appearance, their background, or our preconceived notions, we strip them of their individuality. Bias blinds us to the truth, leading to actions that hurt others and, ultimately, ourselves. The visuals shift to Ms. Taylor delivering her speech at the town hall, her voice resonating with determination. But it's also a story of resilience, accountability, and the power of understanding. Ms. Taylor chose not to let her anger consume her. Instead, she used her voice to shine a light on prejudice and to advocate for meaningful change. Her grace in the face of injustice is a powerful reminder that forgiveness is not weakness. It's a strength that paves the way for growth. The scene transitions to Officer Miller sitting in a bias training session, listening intently, her face marked with introspection. Accountability is essential. Without it, we cannot learn, grow, or move forward. For Officer Miller, this was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront her own biases and begin the hard work of change. It wasn't easy, and it won't be quick. But in choosing to reflect and listen, she took the first step toward becoming better. Images of the Oakridge community flash on screen, officers and citizens working together, children playing in a park, and Ms. Taylor mentoring young students. This story reminds us that change is both personal and systemic. It starts with individuals, choosing empathy over judgment, understanding over assumption. But it also requires collective effort to build systems rooted in fairness, equality, and respect. The screen shows a sunrise over the town of Oakridge, a symbolic representation of hope and new beginnings. As a community, as a society, we have the power to create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued. It won't happen overnight, but with accountability, forgiveness, and the courage to confront our own flaws, we can transform ourselves and the world around us. The screen fades to black, and bold text appears. See the humanity. Make the change. The narrator concludes softly, as uplifting music swells in the background. Because when we choose understanding, we don't just change lives, we build a better future for all.